Dr. Adejo Sunday. Welcome to my YouTube channel where we discuss issues that borders around international relations and international security. So today we're going to be looking at foreign policy analysis. What is foreign policy and what is foreign policy analysis? There's no how a student of international relations or international security will appreciate the behavior of states within the global system without having knowledge of what foreign policy is, what constitutes foreign policy, what are the factors that shapes a country's foreign policy, and of course, foreign policy analysis. Foreign policy analysis is an important component of international relations. Your ability to analyze, your ability to do a diagnosis and a prognosis of the behavior of states within the global system helps you to be an expert and an authority as far as international relations is concerned. Of course, in our first class, when we were looking at the concept of international relations and the factors, that propel the intercourse and the romance between among states, we did say that there is no state that can survive in isolation because, of course, no state is a state of autarky. But in relating with other states, foreign policy becomes very key. In fact, it is the foreign policy of a state that determines who a state should relate with, how a state should relate with another state. It therefore means that there is no conversation on international politics without foreign policy. Every nation, every state within the global system has its foreign policy and foreign policy objectives. If you like, foreign policy strategies. Because like we did say in one of my videos, that the essence of relationship among states is for states to project, to promote, and to protect their national interests. And in doing this, foreign policy is germane, right? So you can tell the behavior of a state when you understand the foreign policy of a state. In fact, the behavior of a state within the global system is a reflection of the foreign policy of that state, right? It's just like saying, for instance, that birds of the same feather flocks together. Can you situate that within the context of global politics? Have you seen certain states that are friends for life? That no matter what state A does, state B is ready to support the decisions and actions of state A. That goes a long way to tell you the foreign policy of state A and state B. When they are birds of the same feathers, when they have similar interests, when they have similar objectives, when they have similar principles, they will likely support themselves. It's like, for instance, a theory in international relations called the democratic peace theory that states that democracies will hardly go to war amongst themselves. That goes to say that foreign policy is a determinant of the behavior of states within the global system. Foreign policy is a determinant of who becomes an ally of a state or who does not become an ally. Foreign policy is a determinant of the kind of alliances, whether military alliance, whether economic alliance, whether bilateral relations, whether multilateral relations, all of these is determined by the foreign policy of a state. Like I always tell my students, show me your foreign policy and I will tell you who you are. In other words, if I understand the foreign policy of a state, I can tell exactly who that state is and what that state is likely to be and what the behavior of such a state will likely be. Right? Having said that, what is foreign policy? And so today's video, we are going to achieve three things. Number one is to understand the concept of foreign policy. Then, of course, we look at the factors that shapes or determines the foreign policy of a state. Then, we're going to do foreign policy analysis. So let's start with the concept of foreign policy. I'm sure a lot is going through your mind. Yes, it's common. You must have been hearing the word foreign policy of Nigeria, American foreign policy, British foreign policy. What is this foreign policy all about? Right. It is important to state that foreign policy, like most concepts in international relations, does not have a single definition. There are different perspectives. There are different dimensions. The concept is nebulous, is omnibus, and is plethora in nature. Hence, scholars have defined foreign policy differently. Some scholars will see foreign policy as the principle. Some will see foreign policy as the strategy used by states. Now, regardless of how you view it, all of these perspectives are correct. However, when we say foreign policy, just like, of course, you have domestic policy. Domestic policies are policies that are used or applied within a state. And a policy is a set of plans, a set of programs designed to achieve certain objectives. And so your understanding of foreign policy is hinged on your understanding of the concept of policy, because we are now blending two variables, foreign and policy. Right? So I can't begin to define foreign policy when you don't even understand what the concept of policy is all about. Right? So a policy is a set of principles, plans, or programs of action put in place to achieve certain objectives. There is no principle, there's no policy that is not designed to achieve an objective. There is no plan that is not designed to achieve an objective. There's no program that's not designed to achieve an objective. And so foreign policy is a set of principles or plans or programs designed to achieve certain objectives of a state in her relationship with other states. What that simply means is that there's a policy that is foreign, in other words, meant to be utilized externally. There's a policy that is domestic, that is within. In other words, such a policy is meant to be utilized within a state. So you have domestic policy, you have foreign policy. Domestic policy is to be applied and utilized within a state, but foreign policy is to be applied in a relationship with a state, with another state. In other words, foreign policy is external, a principle designed for external utilization, while domestic policy, I beg your pardon, is a principle, a set of plan designed to be applied or utilized within the state. For instance, in Nigeria, we have different domestic policies, like Operation Feed the Nation. That's a domestic policy, right? Like we saw under President Muhammadu Buhari's administration, he had a policy against corruption. That's a domestic policy. Under Goodluck Jonathan's administration, we had what we call the transformation agenda. That was a domestic policy. You could even see that different state governments have their own policies. In fact, as an individual, you have your policy. As a family, you have your policy. But all of these are just to give you an idea that the policy is a set of principles or a set of plans or programs of action designed to achieve certain objectives. But in the context of international relations, foreign policies are principles or strategies put in place by states in their relationship with other states. Right? Principles, plans, and programs designed by a state to be applied in their relationship with other states. That's why it is called foreign, because it is external. It was Not Edge who once defined foreign policy as the interplay between the inside and the outside. Now, what that simply means for Not Edge is that foreign policy has a domestic dimension applied at the international space. The interplay between the inside and the outside. Of course, the inside, which is the state and the objectives and the plan of the state, designed for the state to apply in our external relations. No country within the global system that does not have a foreign policy. Every country has foreign policy, and most times these policies are codified in a document called foreign policy. And as expert and as students in international relations, like I did say, that your understanding of states, your understanding of the behavior of states within the global system is tied to your understanding of the foreign policy of that state. For instance, why is Russia in Ukraine? You cannot define or explain Russia's behavior in Ukraine without understanding the foreign policy of Russia. You cannot explain why, for instance, the United States of America has assumed the figure of a global police without understanding the foreign policy of the United States of America. You won't appreciate why Israel is in Gaza doing what they are doing in the name of fighting Hamas, except you understand the foreign policy of Israel. You won't understand why the multinational joint task force was formed between Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon without understanding the foreign policy of the Lake Chad Basin countries. And so foreign policy is an integral component of global politics. In fact, it is the mitochondria, it is the heart and centerpiece of international politics. And so it is key that you understand this, and your knowledge of foreign policy will be able to help you in analyzing the nature, the dimension, and the trends in global politics. And so just to recap, foreign policies are a set of principles, plans, strategies put in place by states to be applied in their relationship with other states. And remember, no state can survive in isolation. It means every state must relate. But for these states to relate, they need foreign policy to guide their relationship with other states. Having said that, what are the factors that shapes, that determines the foreign policy of states within the global system? States don't just wake up and they have foreign policies. No, there are determining factors for the foreign policy of states. And so sometimes in international relations, these factors are classified into two: internal factors and external factors, or what you may want to call endogenous factors and exogenous factors. And so the internal factors are factors within a state, but yet contribute in shaping, in determining what the foreign policy of the state will look like. Then, of course, the external factors, factors that are external, yet contribute in shaping what the foreign policy of a state will be. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's start by looking at some of these internal factors and how they contribute, in shaping the foreign policy of states. And I would like to give us copious examples so as to help us remember some of those factors. One internal factor that shapes the foreign policy of a state is the political history of the country. Political history. Look at every country in the world and their foreign policy. You will discover that their political history has a role to play. The political history, to a large extent, even determines which country they see as friends and which country they see as enemies, or which countries they see as allies. But remember that in international politics, there's no permanent friend, there's no permanent enemy. What is permanent is interest, because the system is dynamic, it is transient in nature. And so just like human beings that are gregarious in nature, just like human beings that are selfish in nature, states within the international system are also selfish. And so these factors are not cast on stones. They are dynamic. However, the political history of a country is an internal factor that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state. Another factor that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is the system of government or the regime type. If a country is practicing capitalism, there's a tendency that such a country will relate well with other capitalist economies. If a country is practicing communism or socialism or Islamic republicanism, there's a tendency that such a country will relate well with other countries that practice the same system of government. Let me give you an instance: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Why did Cuba allow Russia to come and plant her missiles in Havana, when the conflict was not actually between Cuba and US, it was between Russia and US? Yet, Russia was allowed to come and, plant her missiles in Cuba. That was because Cuba is a communist country and Russia is also a communist country. So you can see that communism versus communism, it gives you a beautiful relationship. It's not like the magnetic formula that says like charge repels, unlike charge attracts. No, in global politics, like charge will attract. Countries that practice communism like to relate amongst themselves. Countries that practice democracy would like to relate among themselves. Countries that practice capitalism would like to relate among themselves. The Western capitalist economies, for instance, look at the relationship because they're all capitalist economies. NATO is a product of capitalist economy, right? So all of these are important. So political history, a major internal determinant, system of government, a major internal determinant, economic buoyancy of a country is a major determinant of the foreign policy of the country. A country that is economically buoyant, this buoyancy will reflect in the behavior of the state within the global system. If a country is not economically buoyant, if a country is poor, if a country is weak, all of these will also reflect in the behavior, in the relationship of the state within the global system. For instance, China, second largest economy in the world. In my view, China is the largest economy, in the world. However, China is able to assert herself within the global space because of the degree of her economic buoyancy. China is almost taking over Africa as a market. China is taking over the world in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of things that they do. They are able to do these things because they have the economic wherewithal. Without such economic prowess, you can't achieve anything within the global system. And so economy is a major factor. Economy is also reflected as a factor that shapes the behavior of Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa. No wonder Nigeria has become a Father Christmas in Africa. That wherever there is a crisis, there's a tsunami, there's a disaster, Nigeria goes to give relief materials, contribute money. Nigeria sponsors over 50% of the funding of ECOWAS and of the African Union. You can only do that if you have the money. So economic buoyancy is an integral factor, though internal, but yet contributes in determining the foreign policy of the state. Another factor that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is the military might and capacity of the state. A country that is militarily strong, a country that has military capacity, by implication, a country that has power. Such power will be reflected in the behavior of the state within the global system. It was Lord Action who once asserted that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What that simply means is that if you do not have power, there are things you cannot do. If you have power, there are things you can do. In fact, you will do more than you should do. Right? No wonder Hans Morgenthau titled that his book, Politics Among Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace. What that means is that power, as far as the international system is concerned, is a major determinant of the foreign policy of a country. The ability of a nation to make other nations to do what they ordinarily would not do is a reflection of power. We have seen in global politics that most times nations take decisions that are not originally their own decisions, but because they are under the influence of powerful nations. Of course, today we have concepts like superpowers. What that simply means is that the military might and capacity of a country is a major determinant of the foreign policy of that country. A country that is militarily weak, a country that is military is nothing to write home about, will always keep quiet in the Committee of Nations. But a country that is powerful will always do things and get away with it. Why is Russia and Ukraine, for instance, a violation of international law, violation of international humanitarian law, yet nothing is happening to Russia? Why is nothing happening to Russia? Because Russia is a powerful country. So military might is a very important determinant of the foreign policy of the state. However, it is important that as students and as experts of 21st century international relations, We shouldn't look at military might in the context of the number or the number of personnel or the number of the armed forces of a country. A country may have large number of armed forces, yet that is not essentially equal to military might. Because war in the 21st century, in this era of globalization, war has gone technological and scientific. And so you may have large number of armed forces, but you are not able to apply science and technology in military operations, then it means you are a weak country as far as military might is concerned. And so military might, a very important factor. Another factor that is internal that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is geography or geographical location. The geographical location, the geographical size, the geographical attributes of this state to a large extent determines the foreign policy of the state. Sometimes there's what we call in international relations geostrategy and geopolitics. All of this goes to show you how geography has become an important factor, in shaping the foreign policy of a state. It can create a positive impact for you, it can create a negative impact for you. For instance, there are nations that are bounded by water, right? Such nations have the tendency to relate amongst themselves. Such nations have the tendency for easy trade relationship, right? Let's take a look at Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria's foreign policy has Africa as her centerpiece under the principle of Afrocentrism. We say Africa is the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign policy. And the simple question I ask most times is, why is Africa the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign policy? Do you think that if Nigeria were to be geographically in Europe, will Africa be the centerpiece of our foreign policy? The answer is no. And so it is because Nigeria is located in Africa by destiny or accident of history. That's why Africa is the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign policy. That's why Nigeria is a member of ECOWAS. That's why Nigeria is a member of the African Union. If Nigeria were not to be in Africa, Nigeria wouldn't have been a member of these organizations. And so geography is a factor. Geostrategy is a factor. What are the features of the geography of a country? Is this country waterlogged? Is this country landlocked? Is this country mountainous? All of these contribute, in shaping the foreign policy of a state. For instance, the formation of the multinational joint task force is a product of geography. It is because Nigeria is sharing boundary with Chad, with Niger, with Cameroon, and the activities of the Jemaatu al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, popularly known as Boko Haram, around that axis necessitated that military alliance. If Niger were not sharing boundary with Nigeria, they wouldn't have been members of the alliance. If Chad is not sharing boundary with Nigeria, Chad will not be in the military alliance. And so geography is a very important factor. In fact, the conflict between Israel and Gaza or Israel and Palestine has a geographical dimension. It is a resource-related conflict, right? The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has a geographical dimension. Imagine that Ukraine does not share boundary with Russia. The conflict between Morocco and Southern Sahara, if not for boundaries, they won't even have such. The conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, all of these have geographical dimensions. And so geography, geopolitics, geostrategy are important components that contribute in shaping, the foreign policy of a state. Another very important factor, that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is religion, right? Religion is a very important factor. The religion of a country, to a large extent, contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state. A state that is homogeneous or heterogeneous or multilingual, all of these factors contribute. A state that is pluralistic, all of those factors will contribute in shaping the foreign policy of a state. I give you an instance, right? Uh, Nigeria as a country is pluralistic in nature. We have a lot of Christians, a lot of Muslims in Nigeria. And so, more often than not, the political class in Nigeria finds it difficult to make certain foreign policy decisions because they are careful that such decisions may generate internal crises within Nigeria. Whether good or bad, no matter how good the decision is, if it has a religious or an ethnic dimension, you will discover that the political class in Nigeria are always careful. For instance, Nigeria's membership of the Organization of Islamic Countries, right, generated a lot of turbulence in Nigeria. The Christians, under the auspices of the Christian Association of Nigeria, came up to say that that was an attempt to Islamize Nigeria. Now, why should Nigeria go and join an international organization that has Islamic coloration, even when Nigeria is a secular state? Because the constitution says that Nigeria is a secular state. And what that means is that a secular state does not have a religion. So why should Nigeria go and join OIC? But some of these guys have forgotten that in the OIC, there are other countries that are also not Islamic countries. They don't give a damn about that. They don't give a damn about the benefits we could get from being in the OIC. As far as they are concerned, OIC means Organization of Islamic Countries. Nigeria is not an Islamic country, therefore Nigeria should not belong to such organization. You can see how religion is shaping the foreign policy of a country. That also affected Nigeria's Israel relationship. Because, of course, Christians in Nigeria go to Israel or Jerusalem for pilgrimage. When the crisis on OIC was burning, the Muslims also came up to say that we don't need to waste state resources sending Christians for pilgrimage because Nigeria is also a secular state. In fact, the argument got deeper to the point that they began to argue that the calendar Nigeria is using is a Christian Catholic calendar, and so we need to abrogate that. Because as far as they are concerned, Nigeria is using the Catholic Gregorian calendar, and so we should stop it. So religion is a very serious factor. In fact, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, though both are Islamic countries, but you still see religion creating fracas among them. Because Saudi Arabia is a Sunni-dominated country. Iran is a Shiite-dominated country. And so Shiite and Sunni, there's always that point of conflict between these two sects in Islam. Religion is a major factor. You will recall that when Donald Trump became the president of the United States of America, he had to ban flights from some Islamic countries from coming to the US. And I asked a simple question. If US were to be an Islamic republic, do you think Donald Trump would have banned flights from Islamic countries to the US? What that simply means is that that policy was shaped, that policy was determined, by religion. So religion is a major factor. There are a series of examples one can give in explaining, the impact of religion on the foreign policy of a state. Another very important domestic factor or internal factor that shapes the foreign policy of a country is leadership capacity, leadership quality. And you see, one reason that most countries in Africa have gotten it wrong is because of the quality of leadership that we have in Africa. The leadership of the African states are not people that have the required leadership qualities. Leadership that are product of sentiment, leadership that are product of electoral malpractices. How will they deliver? Right? So the quality of leadership, because in most times, in international politics, the foreign policy of a country is determined by the leader of that country. And so if the leader of the country does not have capacity, what kind of foreign policy will he be able to put forward? Sometimes I take a look at some of the UN Assembly, conferences and conventions or sessions that they have, and you see world leaders coming to, articulate, their interests as a nation. But you see most African leaders there going to read scripts. Sometimes these scripts are written for them by their aides. They don't even understand what is in those scripts. Very unfortunate. Leadership is a very important factor. Have you asked yourself why a Vladimir Putin will be president of Russia for more than 4 times? Have you asked yourself why presidential election in places like the United States of America is not a joke? Have you asked yourself why the British Prime Minister, the position is not a joke? That the British people are ready to bring forward anybody regardless of his citizenship or tribe? The current Prime Minister of the UK is an Indian or a mixed breed, if you want to call it. Can that happen in Africa? Can that happen in Nigeria? The former president of the United States of America, Barack Obama, was a black man. He was not judged by the color of his skin. He was judged by the content of his character and his ability, hence they voted for him. And he did his best for the United States of America, both as a state and as far as the global system is concerned. And so, gentlemen, it's important that we understand that all of these factors put together contribute, to a large extent in shaping the foreign policy of a state. And so we said the political history of the state contributes, right? A good example is that some of those countries that were colonized and later struggled, got independence, you could see that they began to relate among themselves. In fact, the African Union, which was formerly called the Organization of African Unity, is a product of colonial experience. It was an institutional mechanism designed to fight against colonialism and help other states in Africa to gain political independence. And so political history goes a long way. If you look at some parts of Africa, especially West Africa, the recent development is that you see some of these countries trying to disassociate themselves from France because they blame France for colonizing them. They blame France that even in this post-colonial era, France is still determining what happens in their country. And so you see some of them, trying to cut off from France. Political history, system of government or regime type, leadership quality, military might and capacity, geography, geopolitics, geostrategy, right? Economic buoyancy. All of these are domestic factors or internal factors that contribute in shaping the foreign policy of a state. You cannot do any foreign policy analysis without understanding this factor, because these factors will not only help you to understand why a country behaves in a certain way, it helps you to understand that it's a determinant in the behavior of a country. Right. So having said that, we have external factors. What are some of these external factors? One external factor that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is the influence of superpowers. There are powerful countries within the global system that can influence other nations to do otherwise. Influence or powerful of superpowers, right? Very important. There are things that the United States of America will ask a country to do, and the country will do it because they want to plead. They want to please the US. Because they know that if they do not please the US, there's a consequence for not pleasing the US. And so influence of powerful powers. And that is why, for instance, the UN Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members. And if you look at those 5 permanent members, you will discover, obviously, that they are among the most powerful countries in the world. And these countries have the capacity to veto the decision of the United Nations or the UN Security Council. The role of power. All of this can influence the foreign policy of other states. Another external factor that contributes in shaping the foreign policy of a state is membership of an international organization. When a nation joins an international organization, like the United Nations, like the European Union, like the African Union, like the ECOWAS, like the East African Development Community, these institutions have a way of influencing the foreign policy of a state. Because by men joining those organizations, you have to a large extent reduce your degree of sovereignty. Because there are decisions that will be taken within those organizations, within those institutions, and they become binding on you even when ordinarily you will not want such decisions. A good example, a series of resolutions that the United Nations has put forward, and countries are bound to respect those decisions. A good example is Nigeria ceding Bakassi to Cameroon. Why did we do that? because Nigeria was taken to the International Court of Justice and the court ruled in favor of Cameroon, and Nigeria complied with the rulings of the court. If Nigeria were not to be a member of the UN, Nigeria wouldn't have had any business with the International Court of Justice. And so, membership of an international organization contributes. Another good example is Nigeria severing relationship with with Israel. Not just Israel, not just Nigeria. At some point, all the countries in Africa were meant to sever relationship with Israel, even when they had no frosty relationship with Israel on a normal day. Why was it so? It was because Israel had conflict with Egypt over the Suez Canal and some other factors, right? With a series of accords that were signed, Israel still refused. And so, in solidarity with Egypt, which is an African country, the Organization of African Union, now African Union, ruled and passed a resolution for African countries to sever their relationship with Israel in, of course, solidarity with the fellow African country, Egypt. And so membership of an international organization can contribute in shaping the foreign policy of a state. Another very important factor that can shape the foreign policy of a state is global happenings and global trends. The international system is dynamic, it is changing. And so there are factors that hitherto may not exist, but because of changes within the global system, such factors may come up and they begin to shape foreign policy of a state. For instance, we had COVID-19 and we saw countries closing their borders, no more flights into countries. Even when you have good relationship with such a country, but for the security of your citizens, you will sever relationship, you will put an embargo on flights. In fact, the COVID-19 shut down the international system. That was not a factor that was anticipated, but that was a global phenomenon, and nations were forced to adjust. In fact, even in Africa, where we had the Ebola virus, we saw some of these neighboring countries closing their borders, preventing people from migrating into their country so as not to spread the virus. And so there are global happenings that can influence and shape the foreign policy of a state. Another very important global happening is climate change. Just recently, we had a conference, COP24 or thereabout, Conference of Parties on Climate Change, right? To see how nations can come together to minimize the impact of human activity on climate, to minimize the release of greenhouse gas, the release of CO2, that's carbon monoxide, right? The release of carbon monoxide and all of these that scientific evidence shows that contributes in changing, in affecting. And of course, you know that climate change now is a security issue. It has been securitized. And so these are some global happenings that can contribute, in influencing the foreign policy of a state. And so foreign policy is a very interesting topic. In fact, it is inexhaustible. We could discuss foreign policy for over 2, 3 hours, and we may not be able to exhaust, the conversation on foreign policy. And so if you're watching this video, kindly like this video and also subscribe and anticipate more engaging videos on international relations, international security, and of course on strategic studies. Thank you. Bye. This is good.